In the winter of 1879, the wind carved its name into the bones of Bitter Hollow. It came howling from the north, rattling the brittle fence posts, lifting dust from the dead cornfields, and slipping beneath the crooked door of Ezra Pike's farmhouse like a thief. The sky was the color of old ash, and the sun, when it showed itself at all, hung low and dim like a dying lantern. Nothing green had grown on Ezra's land in over a year. Not since the last good rain. Not since his wife died. Ezra sat by the window with a tin cup of boiled chicory and watched the fields that had once fed 5 families. The ground lay cracked and gray beneath a thin crust of snow, stretching like a gravecloth all the way to the bluffs. He could still remember the sound of Anna's laughter as she hoed that field, her skirt brushing across the tall stalks, her hands thick with earth and joy. But laughter didn't live here anymore. Just the wind, the dust, and the memories. He was a tall man still, though his back curved slightly now, like a question he'd never quite found the answer to. A long scar split his left hand, a relic from Antietam, one of the many ghosts he carried from the war. Folks once called him Doc Pike when he stitched up horse kicks and fevered children with calm fingers and a quiet voice. But that was long ago. Now they barely spoke his name at all. He hadn't set foot in Bitter Hollow proper since July. The cabin held little warmth. Ezra kept a single log burning and wore both his coats. A burlap sack lay under the table, tied with twine, his last bag of seed corn, yellow kernels like dry gold. It was all he had left to Plankum Spring, if spring ever came. That morning, the wind shifted, and with it came a sound that didn't belong, a soft cry, barely there, swallowed by the cold. Ezra froze, cup in hand, then rose with aching knees and stepped outside. The snow had thickened to a slow, mean fall, covering the ruts in his path and softening the world into white silence. Near the barn, half buried in the drift, he saw them. A woman, skin the color of mahogany, hair dark as raven feathers, her body curled protectively around 2 children. One of the children whimpered once, then went still. Ezra's heart skipped. He dropped to his knees beside them, brushing snow from their faces. The woman's lips were cracked, her eyelids fluttering. She didn't speak, only clung tighter to the children. "Easy," Ezra whispered. "You're safe." He lifted the girl first, maybe 5, bones too light, breath shallow. Then the boy, no older than 3. The woman tried to rise, but collapsed. Ezra gathered them all and carried them into his cabin, laying them by the fire. For 2 days, he nursed them, boiled water with pine needles, sliced the last of his jerky thin as paper, used willow bark for the woman's fever. He didn't know her name at first. She said little, and when she did, it was in a Lakota dialect he half understood from his war years. But kindness didn't need translation. He soaked their frozen feet, wrapped them in wool, and hummed low to soothe the children's cries. The girl clutched his wrist once in sleep. The boy curled beside him like a pup. Ezra felt something in him crack, not from pain, but from something gentler, something like purpose. On the 3rd day, she spoke. "Enoki," she said, touching her chest. "Their mother." Ezra nodded. "Ezra Pike." She looked at the fire, then at the bag of corn by the wall. She didn't ask, didn't plead. Her eyes held pride, even in hunger. That night, he sat with the sack in his lap. The twine was tight. He had counted the kernels once, enough for one desperate season, one last gamble against the cruel hand of the land. If he gave it away, he might as well dig his own grave. But when he looked at the children asleep on the floor, their faces flushed with color instead of frost, the choice became something else, something holy. By morning, the sack was gone from the cabin. Ezra didn't say anything. He just handed it to Enoki at the door, wrapped in his spare coat. Her hands trembled as she took it, but she didn't cry. She met his eyes and nodded once, solemn as a vow. Then she and the children walked into the snow-covered world, vanishing like mist. He stood in the doorway long after they disappeared, feeling the wind slip around him like the fingers of a memory. The earth slept beneath the ice, but something stirred inside him. Not regret, not fear, but a strange stillness, like a calm before a storm you can't yet name. That night, Ezra dreamed. He stood in his field, but it was not winter. The ground bled where he stepped, red and steaming, and fire danced along the furrows like serpents of light. Feathers fell from the sky, ash-gray and white, each one singing as it touched the soil. The corn rose tall and thick, not yellow but black and gold, swaying in a wind that did not belong to this world. In the distance stood Enoki, her hair crowned with smoke, her eyes lit from within. She raised her hand, and behind her rose the shadow of a bird, vast, winged, ancient. It opened its beak, and from it came the sound of war drums. Ezra awoke with sweat on his brow and a pounding in his chest. The sack was gone. His cabin was cold, but the fire within him burned steady. Snow melted in thin, reluctant streaks, revealing the dead truth beneath: frostbitten roots, broken fence rails, boot tracks that led nowhere. The winter hadn't left Bitter Hollow. It had simply shifted shape, giving way to something meaner. By mid-February, the wind still cut deep, but the fear, thicker than smoke, choked the town just the same. They came riding out of the south like revenants, Silas and May Cormack, born of blood and sharpened by war. Rumor claimed they'd once worn gray coats and rode for Quantrill's raiders. Maybe it was true. Maybe it didn't matter. They brought death with them either way. A dozen men followed, each scarred and slack-jawed, their faces sun-bitten and eyes cold as a January grave. The Cormacks didn't take over Bitter Hollow in a day. They didn't have to. They chipped at it like a vulture pecking a carcass. One by one, they marked the homesteads. A burned fence here. A cow gone missing there. A horse found gutted, tongue nailed to the barn door. No one knew why they stayed. There were no banks to rob, no mines to bleed. Just soil and sweat and families try to make it through the year. Ezra Pike heard the first shot while splitting wood. A crack across the ridgeline, followed by another. Sharp. Final. He didn't move at first. Just stared out at the pale horizon, hands wrapped around the axe handle, breath misting in the cold air. His neighbor, old Bert McCall, had stood up to someone last week about a stolen calf. Ezra knew, even before the smoke rose, that Bert wouldn't stand up to anyone again. 3 days later, the Cormacks came to his door. Ezra stood in the doorway with a calm that didn't belong on any man, especially one whose bones ached from age and hunger. Silas Cormack dismounted with the grace of a snake, boots crunching over snow-crusted earth. He wore a revolver on each hip and a grin that never reached his eyes. May stayed on her horse, chewing a twig between her teeth, rifle slung easy across her lap. "You Ezra Pike?" Silas asked, though he already knew. Ezra nodded. "That's what they used to call me." Silas looked him over. "Doc Pike, ain't it? Heard you saved men at Antietam. Heard you buried your wife out here, middle of a drought." Ezra didn't answer. Silas smiled wider. "Then you understand what loss feels like. That's good. That's useful." May spoke up, voice like shale grinding underfoot. "Time's come for you to pay your share." Ezra kept his arms loose, his stance measured. "Don't have much. Gave most of what I had to folks hungrier than me." Silas chuckled. "We ain't asking for much. Grain. Jerky. Hide if you got it. Or you can pay with sweat. Got a fence in town needs building. Sheriff's given up." "And if I don't?" Ezra asked. May leaned forward in her saddle. "Then you're choosing to be next." They didn't wait for his answer. Just turned and rode off, leaving the frost churned and broken behind them. Ezra stood there a long time, fingers trembling slightly against the doorframe. When he stepped back inside, he found his cup of tea cold, the fire low, and the silence heavier than before. That night, he found the message carved into the wood beside his door. Just one word, dug deep with the point of a knife. Next. He didn't sleep. By morning, the Lakota children were gone. Their little footprints, half filled with snow, led toward the woods. Ezra hadn't heard them leave. He searched the tree-line, called their names, but the wind carried his voice away like smoke. The cabin felt emptier now, as if their presence had kept something at bay. He moved slower through the day, like he was wading through sorrow. He went to fetch water from a well and found something strange. Glyphs etched into the stones around the base. Circles within circles. Lines like talons. a shape that might have been a hawk or a man with wings. He crouched and traced one symbol with a gloved hand, feeling something cold and ancient crawl down his spine. His rifle was missing. It hadn't been taken with force. There was no sign of entry. Just gone, as if it had never been. Ezra sat in the cabin that night, the fire spitting, shadows dancing up the log walls, and watched the empty space where the rifle once rested. He remembered cleaning it after Anna died, each pass of the cloth like a prayer for something to hold on to. Now even that was gone. He walked the edge of his field the next morning and found more signs, feathers, bone fragments, patterns in the frost that didn't melt underfoot. Something moved through the land, not just men with guns and cruelty, but something older. He didn't know what, but he felt it in his chest, in the pause between heartbeats. Back in town, no one spoke louder than they had to. The saloon's windows were shuttered. The church bell hadn't rung in weeks. Sheriff Harlan, once proud, now drank alone by the jailhouse stove, his badge tarnished and his eyes sunken. Ezra passed him without stopping. There was no help to be found in Bitter Hollow anymore. That evening, the sky turned copper, bleeding into purple as the sun disappeared behind the butte. Ezra watched it from his porch, blanket around his shoulders, thoughts turning like mill wheels. The Cormacks would come again. They always did. He thought of Enoki, her quiet strength, the way she had nodded once, with that sack of corn in her arms, like she knew something he didn't. He wondered where she was now, if her children had eaten, if her people had found warmth in the hills. He wondered, too, what she might have left behind. Wind rustled the eaves. The fire inside the house crackled. Ezra stood slowly, joints groaning, and walked to the door. He placed his hand over the carved word, asterisk next asterisk, and stared out into the dusk. "I buried men at Fredericksburg and Shiloh," he whispered. "I've seen hell ride through in boots and uniforms. If it's coming for me again, it won't find me kneeling." The land around him said nothing, but the air was thick with promise. Not hope, not dread, just waiting. The trail between Ezra's cabin and the south ridge was little more than 2 ruts cut through scrub and bone-dry soil. He walked it that morning with a sack over one shoulder, dried roots and pine bark he meant to trade for salt at Cooper's store. The sky was silver with thin clouds, the air still as death. He'd taken the long path, past the old cemetery, past the place where Bert McCall's smokehouse used to stand before it was burned to ash. He never heard the outlaws coming. One moment it was quiet. The next, something heavy struck him behind the knees. He dropped hard into the dirt, a boot slamming into his ribs before he could rise. A fist caught the side of his head. Stars exploded behind his eyes. He tasted blood and dust. "Old man's heavier than he looks." One of them grunted, breathing like a bull. "He got anything on him?" "Just a satchel. Ain't no money in it. Maybe he's hiding it." Ezra felt rough hands flip him over. The world spun. One outlaw crouched low, scrawny, red-haired, with a scar like a fishhook at the corner of his mouth. The other stood behind, a thick-set brute with a broken nose and a hat pulled low. The red-haired one smiled. "You Doc Pike. Silas said you was a stubborn one." Ezra didn't speak. He didn't move. "Reckon I could make you talk." The outlaw drew a rusted knife and jabbed the air near Ezra's cheek. "Reckon I could cut a little." The blade came down, but Ezra's hand was faster. He twisted, arm snapping out from under his coat, and drove the small bone-handled knife deep into the man's thigh. The red-haired outlaw screamed, staggering backward. Ezra surged to his feet, turned just in time to duck the second man's punch, and slammed his boot into the outlaw's knee. The crack was sharp and wet. The brute howled, collapsing sideways. Ezra didn't wait. He grabbed his sack, stumbled off the road, and ran into the brush, lungs burning. Behind him, curses rose into the air, but they didn't follow. Not yet. He didn't stop until he saw the peak of his barn roof in the distance. Later that night, the wind shifted again, warmer, carrying the faint scent of sage and smoke. Ezra sat by the hearth, a rag pressed to the bruises on his ribs, his side aching with every breath. The fire cracked and whispered as though trying to speak. Outside, an owl called once, then fell silent. Then came the knock, barely audible. More a presence against the door than a sound. Ezra stood and opened it without a word. A tall figure stood beneath the stars, cloaked in furs and painted cloth. Feathers stirred around his shoulders. His face bore streaks of black and red, symbols Ezra recognized but didn't understand. His eyes were familiar. He stepped into the cabin without invitation and stood before the fire, unmoving. He smelled of pine, dust, and something older. Earth turned over after a burial. The man reached into a deerskin pouch and withdrew two objects, a bundle wrapped in leather and a small, carved bone whistle, worn smooth by years of touch. He set them gently on the table, then met Ezra's gaze. "I am Wakasa," he said, "brother to Anoki, uncle to her blood." Ezra nodded slowly. "The children, they're safe. They are where they must be. You gave them life. The land remembers." Ezra looked down at the bundle. "What is this?" "Medicine," Wakasa replied. "For what comes." He turned to leave. "What's coming?" Ezra asked. Wakasa paused in the doorway. "Smoke, blood, fire on the wind." His voice was soft, but the weight behind it made the air feel thinner. "They will come for the town. All of it. Then we'll fight. You will not stop them with iron," Wakasa said, "but with truth and fire." He stepped into the night, disappearing as if the darkness swallowed him whole. Ezra stood alone, the bone whistle cool in his palm. That night, the dreams returned. He stood on a battlefield, the dead piled in heaps, smoke curling from craters in the earth. A young soldier bled out beside him, reaching for a photo of a child. Ezra tried to stop the bleeding, fingers pressed deep, but the blood kept coming. Suddenly the sky broke open, and a raven-winged figure descended, its feathers catching fire as it touched the ground. In the dream, Ezra wasn't afraid. He awoke before dawn, drenched in sweat. Outside, the wind whispered through the fields, and something answered. By midday, Ezra noticed it. His field, the one that hadn't grown a single green thing in nearly 2 years, now bore faint lines of green. Shoots, thin and reaching, like the first fingers of spring breaking through the grave. He knelt beside them, brushing frost from the leaves. Too early, too cold, too dry, and yet there they were. He touched the soil. It was warm. When he stood, he saw symbols carved into the nearby stones, same as those near the well. Circles, wings, fire. He didn't know their meaning, but he no longer doubted their purpose. By evening, the sky above Bitter Hollow burned gold. Ezra stood at the edge of his porch, bone whistle around his neck, the bundle of medicine tucked into his satchel. He could feel it all shifting, something ancient waking beneath the soil, something that answered kindness with power and sacrifice with justice. He lit a lantern and walked back inside, whispering a name he hadn't said in decades. Elon, the name of a Lakota boy he once pulled from the wreckage of a Union raid. Bones shattered, skin scorched, but eyes fierce with life. Ezra had carried him 4 miles across muddy fields, stitched him up in a barn under candlelight, and held his hand as he screamed through fever. The boy had lived, and grown, and now stood like a shadow made flesh, calling Ezra to stand again. He knew the time was near. The smoke on the wind no longer came from distant fires. It was rising from the edge of the world, where steel and greed meant to consume whatever still dared to live gently. Ezra Pike had buried men and grown corn, lost a wife, and found a reason to keep breathing. Now, once again, he would be asked to give everything he had to defend what little remained. And this time, he wouldn't stand alone. The morning came slow, bleeding red across the sky like an old wound reopening. Bitter Hollow stirred beneath its haze, still half asleep, unaware that judgment was already saddling its horse. Crows circled above the ridgeline in crooked spirals. The air smelled of cedar smoke and something darker beneath, ash maybe, or blood not yet spilled. Ezra Pike stood alone in his field, the frost crackling softly underfoot. His coat, an old oilskin patched and blackened by time, swayed around his legs in the breeze. Beneath it, he wore the leathers he'd folded away decades ago, blood-stiffened and shaped to the lines of a younger man. They still fit, though he moved now with the weight of memory instead of muscle. Around him, The field looked alive. The strange corn, sacred and unplanted by human hand, had sprouted in uneven rows. Thin stalks, impossibly green. An offering, or a warning. Ezra's face was unreadable. His hands moved with purpose. He'd spent the night scattering powder beneath dead logs and packing glass jars with ground roots and old tinctures. Not traps of war. Not really. But traps of knowing. Smoke, sting, confusion. He remembered how to turn a fevered mind in on itself with the right blend of mint, ash, and crushed nightshade. He remembered how to make a soldier forget what side he was on. This time, there'd be no bullets. Just reckoning. As the first horses crested the hill, Ezra felt the earth shift under him. The Cormacks came with thunder, 6 riders wide, the rest in rows behind, like a parade of ghosts come to collect what the war hadn't finished. Silas rode at the center, long coat flapping, twin pistols at his side. His sister May followed a few paces back, rifle balanced across her lap, eyes sharp and joyless. Behind them came fire starters, fence cutters, drifters with nothing in their souls but hunger. Ezra didn't move. He let them see him standing tall in the field, flanked by green stalks no man could explain. And then, like smoke rolling in before a blaze, they appeared at the edge of the trees. Anoki first, hood down, eyes sharp with knowing. Wakasa behind her, solemn and still as a stone. 12 more came with them, silent and painted, shadows among the trees. They did not advance. They did not raise weapons. They simply stood, like the earth itself had opened and sent them forth to watch what was owed. Ezra walked the long path to his cabin. The outlaw slowed, spreading out along the edge of the corn. May dismounted, boots crunching frost, rifle aimed. Silas slid from his saddle with the grace of someone who'd killed in close quarters before breakfast. "Doc Pike," he called, spreading his arms. "You look ready to die." Ezra stood in front of his cabin door, back straight. "You can leave. Right now. No harm done." Silas laughed. "We rode a long way. You think we'll turn back because an old man asks?" Ezra's voice was low and even. "I'm not asking." Silas grinned. "You think those redskins will save you?" "They're not here to save me." "What then?" "To watch you burn." That was when May raised her rifle, but Ezra had already stepped back into the cabin. The first blast came not from gunpowder, but from the sealed jar set on the hearth, pine resin and sulfur, boiled into a thick, choking cloud. It rushed out the door as Ezra flung it wide again, smoke pouring across the porch like a living thing. The gang staggered, coughing, eyes streaming. Horses reared. The second trap came with a wind, a burst of powdered root and crushed mint, flung from a copper kettle he'd rigged under the window. It struck the men downwind like a hammer, disorienting, burning their lungs, flooding their vision with false shapes and writhing shadows. May screamed. Her shot went wild. Ezra moved with precision. He'd mapped every inch of the cabin, every creak in the floorboards, every weak beam. He'd soaked the side walls in old lamp oil. As the gang stumbled forward, he struck a match and tossed it into the kindling stacked beneath the woodpile. The left side of cabin caught fast. Fire roared upward, licking the eaves, casting monstrous shadows across the field. Ezra emerged through the back, smoke trailing from his coat like wings. A knife at his belt, a pouch of dried yarrow in his hand. He passed the bodies of 2 riders, choking on their knees, unable to tell sky from soil. Silas saw him. "Shoot him," he bellowed. But most of his men were too blinded, too confused. One had dropped his gun entirely and was clawing at his own skin. May fired again. The bullet tore past Ezra's shoulder and slammed into the barn door behind him. He flung the pouch of yarrow into her path, dust rising in a sudden cloud, and disappeared into it like a phantom. Silas charged through the smoke. Ezra met him halfway. They collided hard. Ezra's knife flashed. Silas staggered, bleeding from the forearm, swinging wildly. Ezra ducked, brought his knee up into Silas's gut, and shoved him back into the dirt. "I sewed up men like you," Ezra growled, screaming for their mothers while they bled into the mud. Silas spat blood, snarling. "I am the war, old man." "No," Ezra said. "You're just what it left behind." And with that, He pressed the last flask, glass sealed tight, into Silas's hand and smashed it with a rock. It erupted in light and smoke, a searing blast of sage, wild root, and raw alcohol. Silas screamed, clutching at his face. The warriors stepped from the trees then, not to kill, but to herd. The survivors broke like cattle, scattering toward the hills, eyes wild, some sobbing, some stumbling. None of them reached the town. May Cormack was the last to retreat, dragging her brother, half-blind and gasping, behind her. She locked eyes with Ezra once, and something in her gaze shifted. Not respect, not fear, but knowledge. The kind that sticks with you when the world you thought you ruled burns down around your ears. By the time the fire died, the field was quiet again. Ash swirled across the dirt. The sacred corn still stood, untouched by flame. Ezra leaned against the barn wall, breath ragged. Anoki approached and knelt beside him, offering water from a small leather pouch. He drank, wiped soot from his face, and looked to where the sun was rising behind the smoke. "You are not just healer," she said softly. Ezra looked out over the field, where truth had burned brighter than bullets. "No," he whispered. "Not anymore.